So good afternoon, everybody. I think we will start now. First of all, thank you very much for joining us and for making it through the rain. There are still a few people coming up behind us who may sort of be walking in as we speak, but thank you very much for making it on time. My name is Paul Ladd. I'm the director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD. And my job today is to moderate this event, to first tell you a little bit about UNRISD, and then to set the scene for the report that we're launching today, the topics it addresses, the questions it asks. So after a presentation of the report by my colleagues Katja Huyo and Maggie Carter, and some reflections by special guests who bring tremendous experience and expertise on many of the issues covered in the report, we will invite your feedback, your comments, and your questions. So to start, for those of you that don't know us, UNRISD is an autonomous research institute within the UN system that focuses on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. We've been based in Geneva, in the Palais des Nations, since our founding in 1963, almost 60 years ago. Our strategy is focused on reducing inequalities. And we have 4 research programs, one on transformative social policy, one on gender justice and development, one on alternative economies for transformation, and one on environment and climate justice. And we also have an office in Bonn that concentrates on research uptake and impact. Now, UNRISD is advised by a board of academic experts, not governments or donors. Research autonomy is very important to us. It allows us to ask the difficult questions about systems, about politics and power, about entrenched interests and barriers to change. And the report that we present today, Crises of Inequality, Shifting Power for a New Ecosocial Contract, takes as its starting point the perilous state of the world as we find it today. A world facing multiple, interlinked and overlapping crises that threaten our very future. Conflicts, disputes and geopolitical tensions rage in many regions of the world, in Ethiopia, Yemen and of course Ukraine. The threat of nuclear war hasn't been as keenly felt for 60 years. Continued divisions between countries, often with deep historical roots, manifest in starkly different levels of economic development or voice on the world stage. We have a realization that the climate emergency and environmental destruction are not problems for a future world or future generations, but very much a problem for today. Catastrophic floods in Pakistan, Nigeria, Venezuela, recurring wildfires in the United States, Russia, Australia, extreme weather events that strip people of their homes, assets and livelihoods. Biological threats, the last of which, COVID-19, killed millions of people and closed down large parts of economic and social activity. Moreover, the prospect of these biological threats occurring ever more frequently, precisely because of our unhealthy and extractive relationship with nature, a rise in gender violence and domestic abuse because of lockdowns. We have a growing cost of living crisis, a cost of living crisis for some, but simply a crisis of living for many others, with its roots in war and COVID-19 for sure, but also a decade of austerity that preceded these crises, cuts to social services and to social protection. Austerity ushered in by a global economic and financial crisis in 2008, that itself was driven by greed and corruption. And now food security is under threat in many parts of the world, with all of the long-term implications for nutrition, for education. In addition, this cost of living crisis is exacerbating the mostly hidden crisis of care, a burden borne mostly by women, threatening gains made on gender equality in work and in the home. And lastly, we have a fundamental crisis of trust in politics, in governments, formal institutions, in multilateralism and the UN, in our media, a wedge of mistrust that polarizes societies and erodes community and solidarity. Now, underpinning all of these is a growing sense of injustice, of unfairness, the impacts of the climate emergency hitting the poorest communities when they didn't cause the emissions or pollution. Huge discrepancies in income, wealth, and consumption, a sense that there are different sets of rules for different people, a them and an us, a 99% and a 1%. Now, this report takes that context and asks some important questions. How are inequalities of all types, income, wealth, exclusions, discriminations, related to these shocks and crises? Do inequalities drive crises, and if so, how? Do crises in turn then make inequalities worse? What is the role of elites? Do they look after all of us, or do they look after themselves? Are they a force for good as we seek to stop the climate emergency, to prevent financial shocks, to combat mistrust? The report sets out a hopeful vision for new ecological social contracts, what we call in UNRISD ecosocial contracts, that people themselves in different parts of the world are already fighting for. We ask, what are they and what should they be? How can these contracts be more inclusive, respect nature, be fairer? Lastly, the report looks at the policies that would be needed to deliver on eco-social contracts. What would it mean for economic policy, for social policy, and a renewed multilateralism that bolsters solidarity and cooperation? So let me, at this point, turn over to my colleagues, Katja and Maggie, to present the report to you, to talk through the report and its findings. And then we're going to have some commentary from some special guests. Shara is already here. Thank you, Shara. And then we're going to open up to questions and any comments that you may have in the audience. But over to you, Katja and Maggie.
Yes, hello and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to launch this report today and to have you here in the audience, but also everybody joining us online and virtually. We launched this report in difficult times, as Paul has already mentioned. Challenges appear to be overwhelming and people feel powerless and left behind. The world is at crossroads, confronted with violent conflict, environmental destruction, political and social polarization, the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the skyrocketing inequalities. We have to find solutions as a matter of urgency if we want to avoid further damage and get us back onto more sustainable pathways. Against this backdrop, it seems very appropriate to get together in this new town hall space, which resembles an agora, a central public space in ancient Greek city-states where citizens came together to discuss issues related to the social and political order of the polis, but which could actually be any public space where people meet, a marketplace, under the ombu, under the baobab, to deliberate about key issues that concern their lives and communities. I hope the agora spirit will inspire this gathering. The question the report asks is how we got to this stage and how we can successfully overcome the challenges that are threatening to reverse decades of progress. 7 years ago, we embarked on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which for the first time in the UN history committed member states to reduce inequalities within and between countries. This was a milestone after the MDGs that had focused on poverty eradication without considering the implications of rising wealth and income concentration at the top, or what is also called the 1% economy. Now, this week we celebrate the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And our report makes very clear that for combating poverty and addressing its root causes, it's not enough to look at the bottom of the pyramid. Instead, we have to pay attention to the entire income distribution and how it evolves, how poverty and discrimination interact, how wealth and privilege compound each other, and with which impacts on sustainable development and on governance. The report provides in-depth analysis of our current global context, the trends and crises that shape it, inequality in its various forms, and policy recommendations based on normative frameworks and empirical analysis. And as always, we pay particular attention to case studies from the Global South, many of which grounded in UNRISD projects. The objective of the report is to make a key contribution to the debate on how to address inequality, break the cycle of multiple and interlocking crises, and work towards a more equal, just, and sustainable future. One of the key messages of the report is that inequality and multiple crises are not destiny, but largely the result of policy choices. They are not a flaw in the system, but rather built in by design. This means that we can change course and create a new developmental consensus for climate and social justice, what we call the Ecosocial contract. Next slide, please. The report has three parts. First, it lays out the state of fracture the world finds itself in, marked by inequality, crises, and a broken social contract. Secondly, it analyzes the nature of entrenched inequalities that have become a defining feature of the present moment, focusing on the way different forms of inequality intersect and compound each other and how they are underpinned by pervasive power dynamics. And finally, it explores ways to overcome this current state, advocating for large-scale systemic change rooted in a new ecosocial contract which centers people on planet over markets and rebalances existing power structures. Let me pass over to my colleague Maggie to go further in depth into the report.
Thanks so much, Katja, and thank you all for coming today. We're very happy to be able to finally present this report. Well, as Paul already laid out, the situation seems quite dire, but it's important to note that not everyone, in fact, is losing out. Wealth concentration has increased considerably. Just recently, Credit Suisse released data that showed that the number of high net worth individuals has increased by 50% in the past 2 years. And this is in the context of extreme crisis. This is not a coincidence. Our global system is set up in such a way that it allows a small set of people to profit off of the losses of others, as well as the opportunity that crisis presents to exploit them. Inequality and crisis are intimately linked, and this report sets out to make those links extremely clear. Inequality drives crisis, and crisis increases inequality, and they compound and accelerate to create extreme vulnerability, disparity, and unsustainability. To do this, the report takes a historical approach, exploring the trajectory of inequality and how we got there, and an analytical one, breaking it down into its various forms and manifestations. First, it explores the context, looking at the global trends that form the background of the present moment, as you see here on the screen. Our analysis of these trends views them as neither good nor bad in of themselves, but explores the way specific policy approaches have shaped their outcomes, resulting in a highly unequal distribution of costs and benefits. The outcome then is a cycle of inequalities and crisis, increasing and compounding. To explore and try to untangle this relationship, we first focus on crisis and the way that policy choices have shaped and brought them about. We explore a number of different crises. First, economic crises, and how the shift towards market fundamentalism has increased inequalities, instability, and frequency of systemic, economic, and financial crisis, leaving all but the wealthiest most vulnerable to shocks. We explore the climate crisis, which is reaching dangerous tipping points, as we all know. While the richest individuals, corporations, and countries are responsible for the majority of emissions and resource use and pollution, it's the vulnerable groups that are most affected by the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. We explore the care crisis, which is marked by steep inequalities in both who gives and who receives care. We see an undervaluation of care in the market, deficiencies in public care provision, a disproportionate amount of unpaid care work shouldered by women and communities. And all of this hinders social development and progress towards gender equality. We explore political crises, which are multiplying in the form of violent conflicts, increasing protests and collective discontent, right-wing extremism, political polarization of all types, with severe consequences for democracy, development, and human rights. And finally, we look at the COVID crisis, which in addition to erasing many important development gains, has revealed and amplified extreme inequalities between rich and poor, between North and South, and between social groups. Next slide, please. We try to then unpack the different forms of inequality that drive these crises and are driven by crisis, and how they intersect and reinforce each other. We explore economic, social, and political crises. Next slide, please, Tavi. First, we explore. Next slide. Yes, thanks. We explore inequality as a relational concept, occurring both vertically between income groups as well as horizontally between social groups. And we take an approach that's intersectional, viewing different forms of inequality as interconnected rather than separate categories of oppression, multidimensional, viewing how they play out differently across space and time, and power-centered, viewing power asymmetries as underpinning all forms of inequality. And this is a visualization of our conceptual framework, as I've just described. Next, please. First, looking at economic inequalities. The report explores how they've spiraled upwards during neoliberal globalization and how they lie at the heart of power asymmetries and elite domination. While an overall decrease in global inequality between countries has occurred, it's been driven by a small number of large emerging economies. And gaps in terms of income and other development indicators have expanded for many developing countries. In the past 3 decades, the top 1% has captured nearly 20 times the amount of wealth as the bottom 50%. And currently, 1.2% of world adults, that is people owning more than 1 million USD in assets, own 47.8% of global wealth. And I think this graph gives a very striking visualization of the disparities in wealth inequality. Next, looking at social inequalities between groups that reproduce hierarchies and applying discriminatory rules and practices. These inequalities often intersect with poverty and lack of economic resources, negatively impacting people, the economy, and equity. The report shows with multiple examples and case studies that intersecting inequalities create protracted forms of vulnerability, marginalization, and social exclusion. It's important to note that both benefits and costs of crisis are unequally distributed among groups. Just taking 2 examples that we explored from the report. In the case of expansion of higher education, we have a comparative study of this. In the case of Peru, you can see that women have much lower returns, labor market returns, to expanded access to higher education. And in the case of crisis, we see that employment impacts of COVID are extremely unequally felt unequally. The youth experienced impacts of COVID twice as hard as the rest of the population. And women in developing countries were more likely to lose their jobs during the COVID crisis as well. Finally, we look at political inequalities. Political inequalities and power asymmetries, as we explore, drive and are driven by social and economic inequalities, as elites accumulate influence and power to preserve and perpetuate a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. This makes realizing progressive change incredibly challenging and has particularly devastating impacts for vulnerable groups and the environment. The report examines the different way that those at the top accumulate resources and translate these resources into power and influence, and what the consequences of those power and influences are for our global society. We explore the role of business networks, lobbying, media capture on influencing electoral politics, and the outsized sway that corporations play in global policymaking. Further, we see how the wealthy are better able to shield themselves from crisis and even profit from it because of this power imbalance. We also look at the bottom, vulnerable and marginalized groups who bear the brunt of the negative impacts of crisis, and how their power to do something about this is highly constrained because they lack resources because of the way in which political space is dominated by elites. Many people have said that our system is broken. However, we argue in this report that in fact, inequality is not a flaw in the system, but rather a feature. It is built in by design. The social contract is broken, and I will let Katja take over to explain how we think we need to fix it.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. I think we have presented quite a bleak picture up until now, and it comes as no surprise that citizens are losing trust and being really concerned about their future. They increasingly doubt the rules, norms, and values that bind societies together, our social contract. It is not only the UN Secretary General calling for a new social contract in his Common Agenda report, but also social movements, trade unions, civil society, and business organizations. The report looks into the different proposals of these stakeholders and identify lines of potential consensus, but also areas of disagreement. In addition, we analyze where previous social contracts have fallen short in order to better fix, repair, or rather reinvent and co-create them, and what we can learn from past experiences of making social contracts more inclusive and sustainable. Based on this analysis, we propose a new approach, one that incorporates ecological and social objectives and constitutes a contract for nature, which we call an ecosocial contract. Next, please. Now, how would this new ecosocial contract be different? This new ecosocial contract needs to create a vision for systemic change and rebalance relationships between states, markets, people, and nature. It needs to guarantee human rights for all, create fair fiscal contracts, restructure economies and societies to halt climate change and environmental destruction, and reverse economic disparities. Create a contract for nature, address historical injustices such as colonialism and slavery and the contemporary legacies, as well as the unjust impacts of patriarchy and gender essentialism, and very importantly, strengthen solidarity. Next, please. The report does not stop here. This vision requires concrete policies and institutional reforms, which we present in the form of a new development paradigm that rests on three pillars: alternative economic approaches, transformative social policy and a fair fiscal contract, and a reformed and strengthened multilateralism and solidarity. Next slide, please. I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this three-tiered proposal, but I just want to probably throw in some keywords so you get an idea about the debates that are in this proposal. For the alternative economic approaches, we propose to go beyond green economy and to consider approaches that are more progressive and innovative and also include the social dimensions of the green transition. For example, a Green New Deal that is not only beneficial for the global north, but also for the global south. Just transitions and also sustainable business performance. We are discussing a new role for the state. A state that we could call democratic, climate-conscious developmental state, or as Mazzucato says, an entrepreneurial state. We need to make sure that governments regain policy space, and we have to green industrial policies for catching up. Lastly, we need to re-embed the economy back into society and nature. A very promising proposal for this is social and solidarity economy. But also UNRISD has led an interesting project on sustainable indicators for enterprises. Next, please. Transformative social policies and a fair fiscal contract. That is also a huge subject. There is a lot in transformative social policy, and UNRISD has done a lot of research and proposals on this topic. We propose a rights-based social protection approach, moving beyond targeting the poor, inclusive labor market policies, especially labor market policies that have a macroeconomic vision, that support productive employment and decent work, but that also include policies tailored for informal economy, migrants, refugees, and disadvantaged groups. Universal social services, public quality services, are a cornerstone of this model, as are integrated and just care systems. And after all, we cannot realize social protection floors or put in place universal public services if we do not have a fair and performant fiscal contract. A fiscal contract that mobilizes sufficient resources for climate action and for SDG implementation, that distributes the financing burden fairly within and between countries, and that also promotes global distribution. Finally, national level actions can only take us so far. We also need to reform the multilateral system and infuse it with a new concern for solidarity. We propose to rein in neoliberal hyperglobalization. We have identified neoliberal hyperglobalization as one of the main culprits in a lot of the ills and problems that we have identified. We need more rules and regulations for economic, social, and climate justice. But we also have to address power asymmetries in multilateral governance, promoting the interests of the global South, but also strengthening civil society's voice in multilateralism. And finally, we suggest to strengthen solidarities and values at all levels and with all actors. The report also presents very concrete policies that have proven their effectiveness in reducing multiple intersecting inequalities. Next slide, please. But again, I just showed this infographic, but we don't have time to go into it. But actually, there is no shortage in policy recommendations that can work. And what is actually missing is the political coalitions, the political will to make this happen. So this brings me to the last point. How can we mobilize for transformative change? How can we shift power to make this ecosocial contract happen? The report highlights the importance of rebalancing power relations and building broad-based alliances as the only way to truly address inequalities and crises. Therefore, building a new ecosocial contract or reinventing, co-constructing a new ecosocial contract and implementing the types of policies that I have outlined starts by creating a broad consensus between different stakeholders arrived at through democratic and inclusive processes at multiple levels. And to speak to that, I would like to end my presentation with 3 quotes from activists and scholars who have contributed to the report and which convey a strong message of agency and hope. Kumi Naidu, activist and former head of Greenpeace and Amnesty International, says, ordinary people should be front and center in developing green climate policies. People have a range of resources and creative potential to influence the process. As voters, as wealth owners, as consumers, as citizens, and as holders of knowledge. Reema Nanavati, Executive Director of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, shares the following insights. SEWA's experience of organizing informal sector women workers for over 5 decades in India has shown that to address the multiple challenges these workers are facing, there is a need to strengthen their collective agency, bargaining power, and leadership to help them fight against unjust working conditions and bring them voice, visibility, and validity as workers. And finally, Yayati Ghosh, professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, reminds us that political constraints, such as corporate lobbying power, are binding only if citizens do not apply sufficient counter pressure on their governments. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the presentations of our distinguished panelists and the discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you, Maggie. So we are going to have a couple of discussants, but discussants based very much in a rich history of academic work, but also acting in a very strong policy community. And the first of those is Shara Razavi, who's currently the director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO, previously at both UN Women and UNRISD, heading up Gender and Development Research Program. So Shara, please come up and come speak here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues who are here, and good day, good evening to everyone who's online. A huge thank you to UNRISD and to Paul, to Katja, to Maggie, and other colleagues. I know there's always a big team behind reports. Huge thanks for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be here to hear about the full report, because I only have read the summary, which was available until last night. But I know that the full report is now available online, and I look forward to reading the full 344 pages of the report. I think this is a very timely report. It's very bold in the way that we know UNRISD always is, bold and yet very fine-grained in its analysis and in its recommendations. Inequalities, as you have said, both vertical and horizontal, are driving and being exacerbated by crises. We see this very clearly happening during the COVID crisis, but we also saw the same, and I could see some of your analysis of how the same thing happened in the global financial crises, with inequalities driving the financial crisis and at the same time being exacerbated by it. The interconnections between growing inequalities and a world that is prone to recurrent crises, as you show, is not accidental. There's something systemic there, I should say, and it has come under scrutiny by UNRISD in the past, but I think in this report you're looking at it in a much more in-depth way. The bottom line is that we need both redistribution and pre-distribution to achieve fair outcomes. We need progressive taxation and robust contributory social security systems, but we also need alternative economic approaches to ensure that a higher income share goes to labor, rather than the kind of steady increase that we have seen in profits at the expense of labor. That there is sufficient investment in the real economy geared to the broader goal of social provisioning in the way that feminists talk about social provisioning, rather than continued financialization, as we have been seeing over the past at least 4 decades. And thirdly, like the care economy, ecosystems and natural resources are a critical foundation, you show, for the economy, but are taken for granted and treated as though their supply is limitless and their use costless. The result is the overexploitation of nature, as we see, with us living beyond the planetary boundaries, and the overexploitation of unpaid and underpaid care work, as you show. So we need transformations, eco-social policies, as you call it, underpinned by a fair fiscal contract. And lastly, as you rightly point out, political systems bend toward the preferences of elites. I'm using your words here, which in turn creates a deep sense of injustice, powerlessness, and distrust in the elites that is now, as we know, permeating many societies around the world. And this in turn erodes public faith in democracies, institutions, and as we know, it also creates a very fertile ground for populism and authoritarianism, demonizing minorities very often, migrants, and other subaltern groups. And here, as you say rightly, alliance building is key to have a countervailing political force, to rebalance existing power structures, combining progressive leadership inspired by the common good and grassroots pressure from below, and I look forward to reading much more about those pressures, but also supported by a kind of multilateralism from above. Now, to what extent does the current context of crises of inequalities actually provide an opportunity to change course? That's the question I ask. Moving away from economic doctrines and policies that promoted the kind of patterns of market-led development which have systematically reinforced vulnerabilities and inequalities. In other words, have these multiple crises of inequality seriously eroded and wounded the dominant neoliberal paradigm? I think that's the question that you're asking. The prospects, I think, for social transformation in the wake of a crisis are heavily dependent on
certain paths or path dependencies of pre-crisis structural change. For example, financialization, which you amply argue, it has continued unabated, and we know this has continued through this crisis as well, and has led to this long-term decline. Also, we have seen a long-term decline in smallholder agriculture since the 1990s, with high levels of indebtedness and food insecurity, extensive labor market informalization, and livelihood insecurity, along with the declining influence of organized labor. All of these curtail, I think, what options governments have. These are the grounded realities that we have. They curtail the options available to governments in the social and labor market policy arenas, for example. In addition to these aspects of structural power, elites, those who are well connected to finance capital and elite institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, have shown remarkable capacity to shape the post-crisis recovery process through framing of common sense understandings of crisis and crisis response, that is, of what went wrong, who is to blame, and what is the solution. This means very selective and partial explanations of crisis and crisis response, which end up framing public policy responses to the crisis. It also means that proposed solutions may well serve to transfer risks and costs onto disadvantaged social groups and within a global system onto developing countries, those who contributed least to many of the crises that we experience. Today we hear theorized parallels between the stagflationary conditions of the 1970s and today's conditions, whereas in fact, nominal wage growth is not keeping up with consumer price index inflation. Hence, real wages in developed and developing countries, and there's evidence to show this, are stagnating or declining, ruling out this wage price spiral as the cause of the inflationary context that we're in. UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report of this year that was recently launched provides, I think, a much needed corrective to this narrative that centers of power are currently propagating. And this report of UNCTAD also, like yours, points to structural differences between also the 1970s and today, and significant risks of applying the same formula that was applied in the 1970s to today. As they show, inflation today is caused by a mixture of disruptions in global supply chains, high shipping costs, as well as commodity market speculations. These are the forces that are feeding into inflation, as well as the ongoing uncertainty of an evolving pandemic. In this situation, central banks cannot bring inflation down at a socially acceptable cost. Instead, supply chain disruptions, labor shortages required appropriate industrial policies to increase the supply of certain key items that are driving the inflation. This must be accompanied by sustained global policy coordination and much greater liquidity to support and help countries finance and manage these changes. So in a context where wages and social benefits are losing their real value and purchasing power, and we have from the World Social Protection Database data to show that more than half of social security schemes in the world that we have data for do not have any specific adjustment mechanism so that they can keep up with the cost of with inflation. At the same time, fiscal austerity is only likely to make matters worse. A few weeks ago, I'm sure many of you have seen, Eurodad published a report exposing the dangers of a post-pandemic austerity shock that is gripping the world, one that is far more premature and even more severe than the one that followed the global financial crisis. The report finds that more than 140 countries, and more than half of them are developing nations, are implementing policy measures that undermine the capacity of governments to provide education, healthcare, public care services, and social protection, exactly the kind of social provisioning that you are advocating in this report. This means that the high road for building universal social protection, something we as the ILO also argued for, which everyone could see was needed after the COVID crisis, is unfortunately now having to be set aside as countries have to, in the context of austerity, settle for a low road of very fragmented social protection targeted systems that you have been critiquing very diligently through many UNRISD reports, including this one. And therefore, and this is my last point, we have some very big questions here about the agility of the multilateral system, especially international financial institutions, to really rise to the challenges of deteriorating financial conditions that are gripping many developing countries, as well as some high-income countries. Despite strong advocacy from the highest level of the UN, and the UN Secretary General has been very vocal about this, the performance of the global financial system on the issuance of SDRs, on debt restructuring, and on ODA has been slow and piecemeal, completely out of kilter with the magnitude and urgency of the challenges that we face. In this context, I'm going to leave us with at least a hopeful note that there are many alternatives, and I think many of the alternative viewpoints and experiences that you highlight in this report are ones that will feed our imagination and hopefully create the kind of countervailing forces that are needed to really make a difference in the current context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shara. So much to unpack there, getting to the heart of the macro issues that we do touch on in the last chapter of the report, which was only posted this afternoon, so you won't have had a chance to read through its full length glory yet. But hopefully you'll get a chance to do that soon. We're joined, our second discussant is joining us online from South Africa. She's Masana M. She's currently the Programs Director at Sonke Gender Justice, which is a South African-based non-profit organisation working throughout Africa. She's also a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equality at the LSE. We just check the connection. Masana, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to UNRISD for what I can only describe as a timeous and impactful report. I think at this moment in South Africa, as we're situated within the global political economy and thinking through our next steps and our priorities for addressing the high levels of inequality that we face as a country, it's also an important moment for the report to shape and affect what we prioritize in terms of our interventions, which have typically been gender blind, race blind, ability blind, and in many ways non-intersectional. I think the beauty of the report and what it elevates globally as well as politically in our thinking is that inequality shifts us away from looking only at poverty in isolation and understanding poverty to be the outcome of the failures of individuals rather than the outcome of systems and structures that perpetuate difference between those who have ample and more than enough resources and those who don't. I love the questions posed earlier around how inequalities are related to crises, that inequalities drive crises, but also crises increase inequalities. And as we see in the report and elsewhere across the world, is that the role of elites has amplified how not only has this economic and political power been concentrated, but also to a large extent shaped the influence of corporate interests and priorities over public policy decisions like access to healthcare services that can be reasonably resourced through corporate taxation or wealth taxes. We also find ourselves in the moment where we are asking that question, what are the social contracts that exist? Whilst I might not have a comprehensive answer for the rest of the world, what I do know for certain is that these social contracts currently are not resilient. In fact, they are so unresilient that they can feed into the insecurity and fears that there is another typically brown-skinned person from another country entering into a typically European or Western country who is taking the limited resources, rather than situating the lack of resources, the cost of living crises, within a very real historical narrative of exploitation and marginalization, and the elite pushing the costs of extraction onto those who are not part of elite circles. Furthermore, we need to then reflect on what South Africa can offer to the world as a case study. It pains me in many ways as a young Black South African woman to reflect on South Africa being the poster child of inequality with the highest Gini coefficient in the world. Our vision for a post-apartheid South Africa was one born of hope, of justice. The feminist movement worked very hard to ensure that our constitution was the most robust and expansive set of rights that could be afforded to those who were previously subjugated and excluded from all facets of dignity and livelihood in the economy, in political life, and in access to recourse and justice. And yet, as we have seen, I'm sure some colleagues in the audience have watched, South Africa also shows that hope is insufficient within these current structures to change the priorities of political and economic elites, more so when these elites are one in the same, sharing equal interests. In my analysis in a paper done for the UNDP on social contracts that looked at South Africa in particular as part of a series led by Erin McCandless, some of the things we investigated was to build a resilient social contract, you needed to understand how the state was dealing with historical conflict or injustice. You needed to understand how institutions were being inclusive and fair, especially for those who were historically and currently subjugated or excluded. And you needed to understand the priority and action of social cohesion. The South Africa case study showed us, first of all, that one of the challenges with our transitional justice process was the focus on gross human rights violations, as opposed to looking at the broad spectrum of everyday violations that characterize alienation and exclusion in society based on race, on sex, on gender, on ability. In fact, that these are the very real violations that we continue to see across the world that are catalyzed and mobilized by the far right to push for a regressive political dispensation. Secondly, the South African case study on the social contract showed us that, in fact, it is nearly impossible to adopt and create inclusive and fair institutions in a neoliberal framework. The contrast of there is no alternative, in fact, shows us that currently there is no alternative because of the design of the global political economy. South Africa's concentration or overlap of the political and economic elites means that despite the failures of the structural adjustment programs in the rest of the continent, we willingly adopted structural adjustment programs, trickle-down economics, growth-based economics, to the extent that where we find ourselves, Black women in South Africa are more likely to be unemployed or employed in the informal sector. We see the feminization of poverty, of inequality and unemployment, where Black women have accrued the highest amounts of job losses during the pandemic and have accrued similarly the least amount of economic recovery. The face of poverty in South Africa is the face of a Black woman. Much like the face of gender-based violence, the face of economic and social exclusion is that of a Black woman. And so when we begin to think about social cohesion as the last tenet of a resilient social contract, what the case study shows us is that we cannot have social cohesion amongst unequals. In fact, it is the equaling of access to economic opportunity, economic decision-making, and control and power over the means of production that are fundamentally necessary to sustain and build resilience in our current social contracting. When we step back into the world looking at the Crisis of Inequality report, the fact that the economic crisis has been emboldened by 80% of IMF loans, including austerity clauses for predominantly global South countries, this has direct impacts on the care crisis, where we see, of course, that it is women, predominantly people of color or women of color, who rely on public services in order to access necessary health, education, and economic opportunities, unable to access these because of austerity measures, and unduly burdened by their social reproduction and unpaid care work. We see further then how the crisis of inequality is amplified by the climate crisis. In particular, how then it becomes more difficult not only to maintain the household and participate in a livelihood-based economy where your wages are respected equally, regardless of your gender, but more so that when you have to fetch water, there might not be water. And that many women who I've come across over the past few years are foregoing meals and access to sanitary towels in order to feed their children. And largely the COVID recovery language has been gender blind in our times. This also means that we face that political crisis where women are less likely to be elected for office across the world. And when they are elected, they are viewed as figureheads, as stereotypical, as needing to live up to a masculine embodiment of leadership, when we know there are alternatives to that framing of leadership. I saw a map recently on Twitter, which was produced by a financier, where there was a plan being made for a world 20 to 30 years from now, when 2 to 3 billion of the world's population would have died. And there were small pockets of green on this map in the global north, a strip across Northern Africa, a pocket in Australia. And I wondered, when I looked at that map and the resiliency plans being made, whether people like myself would be included in those plans. Let me step back from what is a very personal and emotional matter for me and many feminists like me in Africa, and talk about what has been working in the fight to end equality. I was part of a panel last year on Ben Phillips' book, How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. And overwhelmingly across his research, what he demonstrated was that it was our collective power and action that would be able to push back against the onslaught of the effects of inequality across the world. I wholeheartedly agree with this approach. In South Africa, in Sudan, in Chile, in Argentina, we see the impact of the feminist movement on public policy and priorities. But this collective mobilization is incredibly costly to us as activists. Not only are we being detained and restricted through civic space restrictions, we are being killed and we are being exhausted by having to put our bodies out on the line. There is a need for a truer and deeper solidarity that taps into that collective action. So if you're sitting at home, now is the time to get up, because we need to counter the narrative that there is no alternative, and something I really appreciate about the report. Because we know that there are alternative models for addressing climate change, for growing and sustaining our livelihoods in just and equitable ways. What do we talk about the ecological model of the economy, or moving beyond growth-based economies towards enough economies, and focusing rather on growth because of its failures to achieve the human results, to focus on well-being? In my concluding remarks, I wonder, how would a single country be able to achieve an enough economy in this global political economy? When we see the race to the bottom, a country decides to increase the minimum wage and multinational corporations are quick to induce capital flight to go somewhere else to exploit other brown people across the world. We see exploitive industrialization and growth in global South countries as well, where not only are they embodying the typical colonial patterns of extraction, but they also feel dignified and justified in doing so because of their own trauma of colonization. There is hope through the global tax deal, but it must be consistent and require equal financial regulation. 15%, when many global North countries have above 15% as their corporate tax, is insufficient to sustain and resource the required measures for just and equitable access to services in the global South. In order to achieve this, we need a democratic vote in the UN Security Council. I said it, I needed to say it. We cannot have true democracy in the rest of the world if there's no true democracy in the global political economy. This would also then hopefully lead to trade equity and justice, including in vaccine-related intellectual property. And finally, the protection of our people-led movement, like the feminist movement, must be valued and prioritized for its contribution to sustaining a world where we don't have to imagine 2 to 3 billion people dying and a pocket of green, when we can actively address inequality in our lifetime. It just takes that courage. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Masana, for showing us that courage and for being with us today. Thank you. And let me just check. Magdalena, are you Are you happy to speak now? I know you had a bit of an emergency on the way here, but if you're ready, then we very much appreciate you joining us. So Magdalena Sepulveda is currently the Executive Director of the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. She used to be, she still is, a Senior Research Associate at UNRISD, and previously between 2008 and 2014 was the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Magdalena, thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here launching this critical and timely report. What I'm going to try to do today is to show the importance of this report and some of the questions that have been raised regarding the particular situation of Chile, my own national country. So how inequalities and crises are linked to a new social contract. I think that is precisely what we've seen in Chile. So in October 2019, massive protests around the country were erupted around the country, demanding a new social economic contract for the society. What for external observers was considered as a crisis triggered by some increase in the metro fare in the capital, Santiago, the slogans in the streets really went to the heart of what was happening. It's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years. Because it was roughly 30 years since the country began its transition to democracy, leaving aside the Pinochet regime, the military regime, the neoliberal regime of Pinochet, towards achieving democracy. So in those 30 years, the country had increased and opened up in terms of the protection of human rights. However, the ideological and economic system that was grounded in the 1980 Constitution was still there and completely valid for the 30 years after we have achieved democracy. So all parties from the political spectrum realized that the only way to channel the social demands was by having a new contract, that those social protests in the street were really the manifest that the social contract in the society was broken and it needs to be replaced. So what they did, they all agree for having a new constitution, a new process. They established the process, the time frame, and the calendar for a new constitution. And that is one of what I think was the critical mistakes in this process. So this political agreement, 10 political parties from all the political spectrum united and signed what it was called the Social Peace Agreement for a new constitution. The idea of this agreement was to establish the calendar for a new constitution, and they established two referendums. The first one was the so-called entry referendum. And in this entry referendum, people were called to vote whether or not they wanted a new constitution. And 78% of the voters said that they wanted a new constitution, but they were also asked what type of process they wanted for that new constitution. And there were two options. One option was a mixed constitutional convention with political members of the Congress and independent members that were elected by popular vote. And the other option was to have a constitutional convention only elected by, composed by citizens elected by popular vote. And 79% of the electorate at that moment in the entry referendum voted for the only citizens elected for the purpose of writing the constitution should be the one writing this new social and economic contract. The continuation of the story you all know. So there was this constitutional convention, 155 elected members who represented the country much better than the Congress. So they were independent. They were more women than men, actually. They were quota for indigenous peoples to be represented in the Constitutional Convention. Those who were elected differed significantly their backgrounds from those who have traditionally held power in the country. They came from public institution, public educational institution. They were younger, and they were from. The majority were not from the elite. They were not political figures. They were exposed very little to the political debate. They were just citizens that were elected because they really wanted to be active part of the writing of the new social contract. So they work in 10 months because the time frame was a political agreement. They didn't have more time to write the text. And in 10 months, they came out with a text that it was quite good. That actually it is a text that if you look at the factors that the UNRISD report consider that should be the factor that need to be taken into account in a new constitution, they were all in there. So it was a text in which there was a very, very strong protection of human rights. And this was, of course, the main difference with the 1980 constitution that had a very limited view about human rights. It is also a text in which gender justice was part of it. So the neoliberal constitution of the 80s really put the male breadwinner as the moral subject of the constitution. And this constitution that was written by a majority of women just completely changed that paradigm and put gender equality, sexual and reproductive rights, and substantive equality all through the text. The other important element is that this new text was addressing historical injustices. And these historical injustices in Chile were mainly related to indigenous peoples. So since our first constitution, since independence in 1810, the country had never even recognized indigenous peoples. We have been completely, all our legal norms, our legal constitution has been completely blind to the fact that we are a nation of built and with several population and indigenous groups. So this text not only recognized indigenous people, but also went ahead to establish some plural national, the recognition of the plurality of the nation and the recognition of a special judicial system. It was also a contract with nature. It was really in an unprecedented manner. The proposed text by the Constitutional Convention established the right to protect the environment and established the right to healthy environment and several norms that recognize rivers and protect our natural environment. We are a country that is suffering for severe droughts. The country is really drying after more than a decade of severe droughts. And in most part, that has been caused by the exploitation of natural resources. It was a text also that recognized new form of solidarity, and this was critical. The paradigm of the neoliberal constitution, and this is the 80s constitution, was placing the responsibility for people's well-being in the individual and in the family. That was all. What they established in this constitution, in this neoliberal constitution, was that the state has a subsidiary role, that it was the private market, the one that has to resolve the social needs and the social rights of people, and when the market cannot restore those rights, then the state has this subsidiary role. So this new text completely shifts this paradigm. So the question is, and I hope that all of you are asking, well, that text was overwhelmingly rejected. 68% of the population in a vote that it was compulsory voting. So and automatic registration. So every Chilean over 18 years old or over was obliged to vote to approve or reject this constitution. And there was overwhelming rejection. So what I'm going to argue today, and very briefly, because we don't have much time, is that the fact that the Chilean people overwhelmingly rejected the text of the Constitution, the text that came out of the Constitutional Convention, doesn't mean that they have rejected or went back to the need and the recognition that our social contract, the current social contract, is broken and that we need a new social contract. And why I'm going to argue this? The first, I'm going to be based on the very clear mandate that the electoral gave to the people. The first mandate was that they wanted a new constitution, that the new constitution was necessary, and this was 78% of the electorate in the entry referendum. The second clear mandate is that they didn't want politicians to write the constitution. They wanted common people to write the constitution. And what could have been the very essence of a very democratic process was also some of the weakness of this process. Because what happened was that these people that were elected very soon became, to the eyes of the Chilean people, being perceived as politicians. They were going into scandal after scandal. And it's true that they were only few members of the Constitutional Convention, but in a very chaotic and complex political environment in which fake news and malinterpretation, and in which an environment in which the media, it's not a pluralistic media, and they have complete control from the radio to the written media and the television. They exploited every mistake of these 150, at the end 54, members of the Constitutional Convention to delegitimize the process. So if one of them in a bad day will say, oh, I believe or I think that the constitution, the new constitution should, let's say, abolish private property, that was portrayed at nauseam, but the media saying that the Constitutional Convention was ending private property in the country. And from there were many, many fake news that delegitimized the process. So Chilean people overwhelmingly rejected the outcome of, or one material outcome of the process, that it was the text proposed by the Constitution. But the process continued. And we have to see this process that ended up with the exit referendum that rejected the text proposed by the Constitutional Convention as one of the building blocks of finding additional and broader consensus to a new social, economic, and social pact in Chile. And I think that what it is argued in the report about how these processes have to be seen as deliberative process at all instances by all stakeholders that are building this consensus on the new social pact. That is what is happening in Chile. So we will continue to have a constitutional process. We don't know at this moment how this new process is going to take place, but sooner than later, the need of the new social contract in one of the most equal countries of the region, that it's already one of the most equal regions of the world, it's going to come out. And that social pact is going to be built, or should be built, on all the shared values that were evident in this process. So some of the texts had been rejected. Citizens did not have any other option to approve or to reject. So if anybody feels very strongly about some of the content of the text of the Constitution, they went for the rejection. And this is the case with some norms that might be too progressive for a very conservative society, in which there is very little civic education. And these are related to the right to abortion that it was considered in the Constitution. It is also related to the plurinationality that it was recognized. So we went for no recognition at all of indigenous peoples, to a plurinational system and a special judicial system. And it was also due to the fact that we were changing the traditional political system of the country, that is a presidential system, because the new text was abolishing the Senate. We are a bicameral state, and that proved to be too much. However, the fact that Chile should retain human rights, that better gender equality has to be achieved, that the level of protection of the nature has to increase and has to be outspoken. The fact that fiscal policies, progressive fiscal policies for public services were included in the proposed text of the Constitution, part of that, it is probably to continue, and we should build from that. And it's very similar to all the factors that are included in this report as the main factors for the new Ecosocial contract. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalena. It's clearly hard when you're trying to do everything at once in a constitutional process. There are so many potential hurdles, but we'll see next year how it kicks off again and whether there'll be a different outcome. We've got about 15 minutes left now for a range of things, questions that you can ask the authors of the report, or indeed any of the people that have commented on the report as well. If you have a comment or any feedback or anything that you found interesting or wrong, then we'd also like to hear that too. So I think we have one roving microphone that Karima will be kind enough to sort of walk around with if you have a question, but maybe if you can just put your hand up to signal if you'd like to speak, and then we can take 2 or 3 at the same time if we have them. Yes, please. No, it's because we're being broadcast, so just so they can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? I work with young people. I work across a whole spectrum of age groups, and the intersectionality aspect of that, intergenerational aspect, is so important. And I am moved and thrilled by this report as a set of like a treasure map to take us forward. And firstly, how can we take the elements of this and give it to young people in ways that they can digest and act on? And if there's one killer question that I could give to a young person in primary school and secondary school, so that they don't just march, they don't just get mad, they get even, what would it be?
Thank you. Would anybody else like to ask a question or give a comment? We're going to immediately test the pedagogical skills then of our senior researchers.
Who wants to go first? Yeah, thank you very much for that challenging question. And it's very good to hear, that all different groups people are working with and across the generations have an important role to play in rules and norms and rights and obligations that we have in our societies. And I think what we would like to achieve with the report is a discussion where everyone feels, part of that debate, of what are you expecting from your government? What are you expecting from your fellow citizens? What are you expecting from the multilateral, from the global system? What do you need in order, to develop your capabilities, your capacities to contribute to society? Because a lot of people are getting increasingly alienated, and they think, that as Paul said in the beginning, that the system is not fair, that it is tweaked towards the interests, of the rich and powerful. And I think that is a very worrying question for youth and for children. And I think I would like to ask them, first of all, your question was, how can we convey the messages or the content of that report, to young people? And I think, first of all, it is about, that they don't feel overwhelmed with the challenges we are facing, but that they also feel that they have a stake in it and that they have a role to play, and that they have actually agency and power to change things. And not maybe just as a child or a young person, but in the future, as someone who's really building the future of our societies. And that they can do so through many, many different actions at different levels, even if they're not voters. I think we try to make clear also that participation goes beyond voting. And the question maybe to a primary school kid or a secondary school, I think I would ask him, what would you like? What is important for you? What is the most important thing, to make you happy in the future? Maybe I would ask the smaller kid, or what are you most worried about, and what you think can we do about it, and what should the adults do about it? And for the older kids, I think I would ask them, how do you see your role in creating a better society? What do you think you can do? But with that, I hand over to Maggie for her.
Thanks, Katja. In fact, we were kind of talking about this 2 days ago, and this kind of collective anxiety about what's happening in the world, and how that anxiety maybe is manifesting differently in different generations, and older generations kind of cognitive dissonance, let's say, because that experience of their life and the world they lived in is so grounded in their in their past, and for them it still seems like that can be their future. And I think that for younger generations, I think I see, especially with the sort of generation coming of age right now, just a shock that that cognitive dissonance exists, because it's so clear, these problems. And so I think for me, it's about, and what this report is trying to say is that you can imagine alternatives. I think that Masana gave us a lot to think about also in that regard, that you have to visualize together what an alternative future can. And I think putting those things on paper and writing them down and saying these systems don't work is hopefully that can show some young people that are so overwhelmed and by the fact of this kind of lack of action, that okay, there is an agreement on some level that there is an alternative. We don't know what it is and what's going to work, but it's worth actually going down that path, and not just saying, well, nothing ever is going to change, because there are ways to think about it differently.
Thanks. Let's get an additional prompt from Jem, who I was talking to before the meeting, who's actually looked into what actually kids think about the world we've created for them.
A comment, and then to invite your thoughts. I'm wondering, so my name's Jem Bendel, I'm an academic, and we now often hear people critiquing, finally, neoliberalism and identifying it as a systemic driver of all manner of problems in society and all manner of societies around the world. But I'm wondering if actually neoliberalism is as much symptom as cause, and to the extent to which we may be in a new era that's somehow post-neoliberal, which involves a hell of a lot of state, you might call it corporate socialism. So central banks buying billions of pounds or dollars worth of corporate bonds, and the government's handing out billions to corporations. The UK government, we don't know where 37 billion went in the pandemic. So I'm wondering if there's something deeper and worse than neoliberalism, which is already there and will continue to get worse. And it's just basically incumbent power uses whatever stories and rationalizations it can. And neoliberalism was the story for a while. And now it's going to be another story. It might be basically perma-crisis. And because we're in a perma-crisis, the state must do whatever it wants with its buddies in whichever corporates it's closest to. So I'm wondering, there's basically a bit of a provocation and invitation to reflect on that. Are we in a post-neoliberal age already? What does it look like, and how bad is that for inequality?
Thanks, Jim. Can we just check again to see if there are any other people in the audience who'd like to make a comment, ask a question? Yeah, gentleman at the top. And then...
Thanks. Just as a small response to the last deliberation, I recently had a small piloting with UNESCO in South Asia. So there we were testing the socio-ecological resilience of one of the UNESCO heritage sites, Sundarbans. It's a world's largest mangrove forest. So our finding, one of the many findings is that especially colonial countries, as well as, and this is prevalent even in post-socialist countries also, that state considers forest or any sort of natural resources as a revenue generation opportunity. And this the same colonial policy inherited by the Indian or many other South Asian countries. So this is a response I thought just to mention. I'm with the Graduate Institute here, the Global Health Center. I come from public health discipline, but just to say that perhaps, especially in South Asian context, as well as many other global South, the pace of the elite hadn't changed much, while transgressing from monarchism to corporatism. And that's how, I mean, the coloniality still persists. I have a very, sorry, I'm just intrigued by one question. That Jayati Ghosh was my faculty in JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She taught there for almost 30 years until 2020. We are having there, I mean, I had my PhD from there. So we had a very fierce discussion in the campus that, and this ecosocial contract. So, I mean, to both of you, what do you think, that politics of equal opportunity or the politics of equal outcome, which politics will determine this new ecosocial contract? I mean, if we see the democracy in its various ways, layers right now, these are the two dominant politics is going on, the contestation. I thought. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, take one more. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amy, and I'm an anthropologist. Interestingly, while you were speaking, first of all, congratulations on a really thought-provoking report. I was thinking of the more is less concept, because we definitely need more financing, more human rights, more nature, more support, more care. But then in the Chilean context, it was less is actually more, because the complexity of the process actually, in the end, scuppered the process. And so to ask you, to put it simply and to kind of get through the complexity, what would 3 things be, or 3 processes to actually implement a social eco contract? What are the actual practical ways to do such a thing in 3 simple terms?
Thank you very much. And as Karima brings the microphone back to Katja and Maggie, it's just gone 5:30, and I am going to have to step away for a few minutes because I have a call with the Deputy Secretary General, which was arranged outside of my sort of schedule. But I think you'll be gone and hopefully having a drink by the time I get back. But please go on for a few more minutes if you want to. But just to say thank you very much for coming. It's of course a real labour of love to put all this time and thinking into a huge report as this. It's great to have you as our audience here to test out these ideas. We've been joined by, I think, another 80 or 90 people watching us online. We also had a launch event in New York. But we really do appreciate your time and your feedback and your comments. I also just want to take this opportunity to thank UNRISD itself. It's a very small, important, progressive jewel in the UN that can do things like this when other bits of the UN can't. And I deeply appreciate the commitment of the staff and the time that they give to making UNRISD such a success. So thank you and apologies, but I'll be back in a few minutes.
Yeah, I say thank you, Paul, and vanishing up the stairs. But yeah, thank you very much for the very challenging questions. Yeah, what can I answer? I think the issue with neoliberalism is probably, as with any ism, you know, we talk about it as something very much kind of set in stone. We often don't distinguish between theory and practice and how it actually evolves. We use it as a buzzword very much. I think there have been excellent, you know, deliberations about it. What is at the core, how it has been applied, and maybe in which direction it is evolving. Again, I agree with you that often when we talk about market fundamentalism, neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization, we think that we are actually in a very competitive, market-driven global economy, and actually we are not. There is even, I mean, when we wrote the report, a lot of people reminded us, because we use these terms so much, you know, that they said, look, there's actually a huge amount of market regulation going on. And often even the developing countries are highly regulated. So there is not, you know, we are not living in a very free, laissez-faire market economy. But what we want to say is that, you know, we have to really look very deeply what type of regulations exist, who has implemented them, you know, and who is benefiting from them. And I think this is why we put so much the spotlight on the role of elites, of, you know, big companies, of the financialization, the role of financial institutions that often override even the interests and of productive, you know, of producers, of small holders, of small and middle sized enterprises. So I think what we want to criticize is a regulation that is biased, and that, you know, promotes rent seeking and concentration of wealth and profit accumulation, and deprives, you know, the system in a way of all these revenues, but also of the economic opportunities then, you know, that others could actually grasp. And maybe that leads me over, you know, to your question. What is more important for addressing inequalities, you know, promoting equality of opportunity or outcomes? That's really it's a discussion that is at the heart of UNRISD. I remember when I joined UNRISD many years ago, you know, there was this World Development Report where there was a lot of discussion. It was the report on equality and inequality, and we discussed opportunity versus outcomes. Our stance usually is to say we need both. We need definitely equality of opportunity, but we can't stay there. You know, that is very much the approach, you know, that the international financial institutions have taken, that a lot of the more liberal economists are taking. You know, if we have a level playing field, if we provide access, to educational health and labor market opportunities to everyone, then we erase inequality, everyone can succeed, but it's not the case. I think when you look at, we also discuss, it's closely related to justice concepts. If you have this approach, you certainly ignore historical injustices. You certainly ignore that even, if you create some equality of opportunities, a lot of people are so far behind, that that there's no way, that they can actually grasp these opportunities, that they can actually take advantage of them. To make it short, we need both, but I think we have a very strong emphasis on inequality of outcomes, because at the end of the day, people have to live today. And if a crisis hits, we have to make sure that they have a guaranteed income, that they have access to health if we have a pandemic, and that they have access to education. So we can't wait, for social mobility. And actually, social mobility is going down everywhere. So maybe I pass on for the other question to Maggie.
Yeah. So thank you all for your questions. So this question of how to implement an eco-social contract. Well, I mean, I think that obviously you said you premised the question with less is more, so you want less, I assume. But I think that it's true that the report has a lot of ideas, and we break them down into different categories around transformative social policy. And I think our argument is that, of course, any advancement in any of those categories is a win, but that they're so integrated and interconnected that you can't simply say, we need to, target a labor market policy, or also targeting a care policy, for example. I mean, I think that without taking this kind of integrated approach, we're not necessarily going to get very far. So to sort of pin down specific policies, maybe that's a harder question. But in terms of how to do it, because there's two kind of hows. There's hows like with what, and hows like who, and what's the action. I think that at the end of the day, our arguments about power and about who controls the rules, and we think that any progress, any step that in some way chips away at the sort of complete access to making the rules of the game that elites have will create opportunities for the rest to be able to push into those spaces and make some change. So I mean, there are, we talk about transforming multilateral system, and I think that's central if we're talking about global on a global scale, to create more spaces for civil society, for members of the global south to participate in decision making. And I think that by having these conversations in the UN with the UN report that opens up a discussion about that and about power and about elites is a value added, is something we're trying to do. Because we aren't trying to say that, we do think that civil society and that, local actors, people at the grassroots are going to be the ones to push this change forward. But, and so we're not saying that we have those at all. I think that it's about creating space for people with that knowledge and experience to step in and take on that role. So shifting power, really opening up spaces, taking power away from elites and towards the rest is central argument.
So I'll take the role of poll for a second. We're gonna get a last round of questions. Last round.
No, thank you. I just wanted to come in on this point about equality of opportunity and outcome. And there's a very nice quotation from Tony Atkinson, who used to be a member of the UNRISD board and a very well-known economist working on inequality. And he says, if we are concerned about equality of opportunity tomorrow, we need to be concerned about inequality of outcome today. And in fact, if you look at data, there's even economists have the so-called Great Gatsby curve. countries that have equality of outcome, that have low levels of income inequality, are also the ones that have greater intergenerational mobility. So in fact, the two often are very correlated. So just wanted to make that point in response to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see two more.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this presentation. My name is Julia Rivero. I work for the World Fair Trade Organization. Thank you for gathering all this data. It's just awesome, but also it doesn't give a lot of hope. So my first question is about, well, we represent social enterprises all over the world, enterprises that have a social mission that put people and planet first. My first question is, do you see a good environment for these kind of responsible businesses to thrive, or is it too late? Because big mainstream businesses have taken all the market, same as for monopolies. And my second question is, how can we as international organization support these businesses? What are the key actions and how should we best drive our efforts?
So first of all, thank you so much for this report. I think it's really, I'm very pleased to hear that we're having, for me, what is like the real debate is like, how do we shift power? How do we go away from those elites back to the citizens, civil society, the public, everything who is, all the people who are actually suffering from those different policies and current power structures. And so my question is, I really like how you were framing this, going away from policy more into like governance and how power is structured and everything, and then who makes a decision, and then creating more spaces for, you know, like other people to get in there. And so if we agree on this, then my question is like, in terms of the backlash that this might create, because like, I think Masana mentioned that people get killed, like activists get killed, journalists get killed, kidnapped, threatened. Their families are, you know, threatened because they tried to actually fight against those existing power structures. And so what I'm wondering is, how can we prevent this, or I don't know, work with this constraint of those backlashes that will happen if we actually try to implement this new ecosocial contract? And that's what really is scaring me. And I also want to react about like the Chile story, about how like all the media and the existing powers try to delegitimize what was going on, which was a very democratic process. And so systematically, whenever we try, we fail because the people that have the power do not want us to succeed. And so that's, yeah, very briefly what I want to know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. More hard-hitting questions. I mean, in terms of how do we prevent backlash? I mean, to be honest, I think the situation is such that that backlash is kind of, the situation has become such to a level of such instability and extremity, extreme anxiety that backlash is kind of the only. For me, it's hard to see a way that backlash won't happen, but it's happening from all fronts, right? But backlash is, I mean, there's so many negative sides to it, and that it's, as you said, I mean, as Sana said, people's lives are on the line. But the other side of it is that it creates more resistance. I think the more visible that it is, the more that we see it and then we talk about it, people's reactions to it are stronger. And I think this brings people out of the woodworks, brings people ready to come to this and fight and push for what they believe. So maybe the answer is that the backlash, we're going to expect it, and how do we use it? How do we not shy away from it, make it visible, talk about it, point to it, say who the actors are and what what they're what they're doing and what those outcomes are, and making those stories visible. I think stories are really important, faces, rather than just saying a sort of blanket sort of outcome, but saying like these are the people affected and these are the outcomes. I think there's a lot of power in that. Perhaps we have to actually look at the backlash, make it visible, and use that to get people engaged around it.
Yeah, I think we also used the concept of a social contract or an ecological social contract because it is a non-threatening concept, because it is bringing everyone into the boat to a certain extent. And if you talk about backlash, I think backlash, resistance, different positions, it's part of our society. It can become threatening, illegal, and violent, and I think we need to stand up against that. But in general, a rejection of a proposal, a different opinion, is absolutely legitimate in democracy. And I think when we talk about a social contract, what we want to say is that we want to create something, where people can buy into, a majority can buy into. And that often means, then of course a discussion, are we settling on a lowest common denominator? How do we actually push the, radical systemic change we need? But I think if we consciously use that image and that approach of a contract, of a social contract that talks about rights and obligations, about who does what, what is the big vision, but also how will it be put into practice. And we see the example of Chile, of that it is complex, complicated. It takes time. There are different visions. It needs a lot of scrutiny. It needs a lot of learning and expertise also, it's not just sitting together and coming up with something. So it's a long process. And I think in that sense, there are no easy answers how we can put things into practice. I think the report shows the immense complexity of challenges, and it proposes alternatives. They already exist. We have a lot of data and evidence about them. And there are different opinions. People want other policy choices, but we are very confident that what we propose is something that works and that really addresses the root causes of the problems we have. So now, in a way, is a time to convince others, and to use all the different mechanisms that the democracy allows. And that's social mobilization, alliances, being active in politics, being an expert, and publishing data and reports and saying this works and this is important. So yeah, I think even when we talk about the social contract and we talk about power, actually a big question is also how do we bring the elites back into the contract? I mean, we mentioned that several times in the report. We have to re-engage these elites with the social contract. There is no working social contract without elites. And when we look at the history of social bargains, we criticize elite bargains, but those bargains that have been successful often had actually capital on board, had somehow the business interests on board, but in a way that also had benefits for others. So there are big questions. There is a lot to learn from history, but also we are in a different moment now. So we might need different answers, but I think we need all this toolbox, of political action. On the business question, there is a lot in the report actually that goes quite into depth on the issue of both market regulation, how one can kind of rebalance asymmetric power within markets through policies and regulations, how to curb this overwhelming dominant position of multinational companies. Again, there is no easy answer. It needs a lot of interventions and changes at all different levels. We talk a lot about global value chains and how asymmetric they are. And there are a lot of, good proposals of how things can be improved. But again, it's not a quick process and it needs reform at multiple levels. On the social and solidarity economy and on these different economic approaches and that have a very different mindset actually, and a different governance ethics, I would say, and that bring in a lot more than just a profit motive, like democratic governance and gender equality and environment solidarity. Again, there are public policies that can support these entities. Sometimes public policies also are an obstacle for these entities. So it's very important to look, what the legislature is, the framework. And the report has a lot in which I can't possibly summarize here, but I encourage you to look into it. I also wanted to say, I pass over to Maggie also, but now that we are in the final round here of this event, I wanted to really thank Shara and Magdalena and Masana for the excellent contributions. I mean, I was really so thrilled to hear also that, these concepts, which sometimes sound so abstract and so academic and philosophical, like a social contract, that there are actually living experiences of a process, where this is in the making. I think the Chilean example is so interesting. And again, what Masana talked about, the life of an activist, the life of a Black woman, trying to address gender inequalities and so many inequalities in South Africa, one of the countries, that has a very progressive constitution, that has set onto a path of complete and radical change of the past, and is still struggling with so many odds. And that's also an exhausting experience, and that solidarity has a real cost. I think, sharing that was so powerful and so important. And again, also Shara, bringing in that macros perspective, and actually how so often, the kind of narratives that we hear from mainstream economists, which are famous, which have a lot of voice and influence, what we hear in the news, they sell one particular story, but there's always, also a different story behind that, and a lot of what we hear is actually not true. And so, as a research institute, we have that responsibility also to put the right facts out and the right evidence out in order to support our arguments. And we hope that we, have succeeded in a way, and we will hear from you about that, to bring evidence, very rigorous evidence and country level experience, to also to support then also a call for action that is, of course, also based on a normative framework, which resonates, with the mandate of the UN, of our institute, but also with economic, social, and ecological justice. So bringing these things together, I think, is at the heart of the report. A normative framework, call for action, but also the evidence that shows, that these policies can work. I also wanted to thank, the team in UNRISD very much, for working very hard to finalize the report, especially Sergio Sandoval, who has done the layout and the design and worked day and night to make it happen. And of course, the research team, the editorial team, and everyone, and Paul, who is not back from his call, but who has supported this process immensely. So yeah, thank you very much from our side, and thank you for all the interesting questions and for being here. And I hope we can continue the conversation, because there are a lot of open questions, there's a lot to do, and this is just a starting point. Thank you.
Thanks, Katja. I'll just say one last thing before I pass to Karima to close. So UNRISD, and I think we talk about the real significance of sharing knowledge in order to create change, but you can't share knowledge without finding a good way to communicate it. And so just wanted to recognize the incredible work of the UNRISD communication and outreach team for creating these beautiful products for you. And so we really encourage everyone to spend time exploring those and the amazing visuals that we hope will help get the message across even further.
Since it's thanking time, then let's thank Katja and Maggie for the excellent presentation, the very hard work that's behind months and months of work. So applause for them for their great work. Well, the team, David, for making this happening, and Osiam is hidden there, but it played a good role on the social media. And of course, applause to you for being here and being motivated and bring forward this message through all your work. One more last thing, your feedback is important to improve future events or reports. So it really takes a few minutes. There's some QR code around and you can just do it during the cocktail. And we have a little cocktail just if we want to continue the discussion and exchange informally. Right around the corner, you can follow us. And please take your copies. There's also digital ones. If you also want to have more information, just contact us or have bring our authors to your organization and have some presentation. We are very available. So thanks again. And hopefully we continue around the corner.